Hi there, this is Carl Irwin, and this will be a tutorial on how to write music. I had a video that I posted some time ago on the channel titled How to Write Music, and the basic gist of that video was to explain that in order to write music, one really just needs to investigate their own desires in manipulating the language of music as they see fit. And there's some, I think, simplified, reductive ways to look at writing music that should make writing music accessible to anybody. And I don't particularly prescribe to the action of gatekeeping. That in order to be a good composer, you have to jump through so many hoops and have a certain amount of schooling from certain kinds of institutions. I think really to be a good composer, you just have to have a vision, and you need to practice your vision and put it to practice. And really anybody can write good quality music that can be enjoyed by people. Individuals who are seeking to write music, I think by and large, are not looking to compose material in a vacuum where it only satisfies their own vision without any real regard for an audience. I think most artists are trying to create art that will speak to people at large. And in order to do that, you have to work within a shared sort of language, a language that is shared by the audience. And we're going to talk a bit about that. Okay, so first I just want to head this off by saying that what we're doing here, these are not tricks. This is not a video about tricks for writing music. Okay, I don't believe in that. What I believe in is reduction. I believe in reducing things, concepts to simple, digestible, concise explanations. And that's what we're going to try to do here. So what I invite you to do, if you are schooled in music, and particularly music composition, if you have some experience, an educational experience in this, I'm not going to ask you to forget everything that you've learned. Instead, what I would invite you to do is to latch onto the simplest things that you have learned. I think that anything worth knowing can be explained in simple terms so that anybody can understand it, and that's what I'm going to try to do. So we may talk about some concepts where you'll be thinking, but there's a very intricate term for that, or a more complex a sort of structure in which something that I'm discussing fits into. That's wonderful. I'm aware of that. I'm just trying to reduce ideas and concepts into a place where we can quickly and efficiently and still completely understand it for its value. So we're going to reduce a lot of ideas here. The next thing is, I think a lot of people, when they are looking to compose music for a shared vocabulary, they're probably interested in writing music that fits a Western concept of consonance rather than a 20th century and later postmodern sort of form of dissonance. Consonance, I think, is really what most composers are after, some kind of control over a consonant sound that doesn't sound weird and awkward, but sounds controlled and it sounds inevitable. So we're going to talk about working in a Western understanding of consonance. So not necessarily world music or any kind of special style of music, but we're talking about a westernized, a Western sort of perspective of sound. There's a shared narrative there, a shared vocabulary. Now, within the shared narratives, I think we're going to need to discuss intervals, that is, the relationship between two notes, so that the meaning, the narrative meaning that can be found intervallically between the relationship between individual notes that might be played consecutively one after the other, or two notes that are played at the same time, but also intervallic chordal relationships. That is, the movement of chord qualities that whose root notes have an intervallic relationship, a diatonic intervallic relationship, or even a chromatic relationship. It's some kind of interval between the root pitches of two different chordal structures. And what is the meaning there? Is there a narrative in listening to one chord moving to another chord and back again, and combinations thereof? So we'll have a discussion on that as well. And then lastly, what we'll talk about is dealing with controlling consonants, the sound of kind of consonant Western music, with complex chords. These are chords that are not merely three notes, but have added notes or some kind of extension to them. So this will not be exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, and there will be some elements that we simply don't get into, some perspectives that we don't discuss, particularly when it comes to extended harmonies, jazz harmonies, and whatnot. We'll try to keep this focused on traditional triads and added notes in those kinds of triadic structures. So that's the scope of our discussion here. Let's get started. I will have available in the description a link to PDFs of the projects that we are looking at here. So these are some worksheets that I've put together, and they're, again, not at all exhaustive. They are very basic, and they're my personal perspective. But I think that what I'm sharing here is so basic and so fundamental, so rudimentary, that it probably has a fairly widely shared perception. So first we're going to look at basic intervallic phenomenon. So this is the phenomenon that we experience when hearing two notes played together. What is the feeling that comes out of that? We're not talking about what is the function, as we normally would in music theory. Normally in Western theory, we discuss the function of the relationship between notes, and particularly with chordal movement. Here we're looking at the phenomenon. We're looking at the emotional and, to some extent, the intellectual narrative that is drawn out, that is made manifest when notes are played together, either in sequence or simultaneously. So we're looking at just two note intervals. And what I've done here is I've made a sort of a classification of intervals, and very, very simple. These are just basic kinds of descriptors, just a couple of descriptors for each one, very vague and open generic descriptors, so as not to be too specific. I think you can get very specific. I would invite you to do a similar exercise and make as specific a list as you can with descriptors, so that you have your own cue sheet, I think, to refer back to as you are writing music. But the idea here is that if we can establish that two notes have a relationship that evokes an emotion, you can, in your writing, call upon these specific emotional qualities in choosing the notes that you're going to use to write for the purpose of evoking a feeling, evoking an emotional response that is shared by a wide audience. So I'm going to play through each one of these, and just, you can hear what the interval sounds like, and then I'll briefly talk about the classification, the emotional classification that I've assigned. Okay, so this is a minor second, and it creates a great deal of tension. Now, I perceive that there's both a sense of aversion, that is to say that the two notes are pushing against each other, they're rubbing against each other, if not pushing away from each other, but also there's a sense of attraction. Obviously, a minor second does have a leading tone relationship, that one note wants to lead to the next, particularly if they're played sequentially, one after the other. So you kind of get both qualities depending on the context. The next one, the major second, also has a tightness and a closeness, and there is a slight tension there, but it's not quite as strong as the minor second. We want to keep this in mind. There is a closeness and a tightness. There may even be an element of warmth there that we get from pop music, more contemporary Western music. And this is an idea that we're going to investigate later on as we talk about thickening up chords. But you get tightness, closeness, slight tension, but not really this aversion and attraction that we get from the minor second. The next is a minor third. This gives us kind of a dark quality. Obviously, the minor third is what makes up the minor quality of a triad, of a simple triad chord. And it's dark. It might be somber. It might be serious. It also has a jazzy quality to it. That is probably the most heard and perceived blue note in blues, in the blues scale, would be that minor third. Second would probably be the flat seven, which we'll get to here in a little bit. Next one. The major third. It is has a comfort to it. It is resolved. It is steady. It is very consonant. It's a very consonant kind of sound. Again, that major third is what gives us the major quality of a triad. So I think it evokes these kinds of feelings: comfort, a resolved sort of a sense. Next one. Perfect fourth. It's open. It's a little ambiguous. It's not really resolved or has a settled feeling. It has an ambiguous feeling, but it is open. It's neutral. I think it feels a little reflective. Americana is built on open fourth chordal harmonies, something we'll talk about later on. And you can see how it has that kind of reflective, ambiguous, neutral kind of quality to it. I'll also note that each one of these examples also includes the inversion interval that goes along with it. So the minor second is an inversion of a major seventh, and so on. And I only put them on there for reflection because you'll see that as we go through the list and we find these inverted variations of those exact same, essentially those same relationship and tones, just in an inverted context, you'll find that the feeling does change, but it might not be a drastic change. There might be a relationship between the two instances of the same essential interval. Next one. We have the augmented fourth. This is the tritone. It is askew. It's unbalanced. It's unresolved. It's just off kilter. And a very well-known harmony that is used, particularly in film music, to portray all those kinds of ideas. It wants to move to something else. It doesn't really want to stay where it's at. It's not stable. It wants to change in order to get resolved. So that is the augmented fourth. Next one. So the perfect fifth is very strong. It's reinforced. It's an open harmony. It feels stable because it is using the top and the bottom note of a triad, major or minor. It is known as the power chord when you're dealing with guitar kinds of backup sounds. You can play power chords that are ambiguously neither major nor minor. It's just those outer tones of the triad, very, very strong, very stable kind of sound, used for strength. The augmented fifth, or the minor sixth, is a open expansive kind of sound. It also, kind of like the augmented fourth, the tritone, it also feels unsettled, like it wants to resolve somewhere else, but it's not quite as unstable. It has a sense of open, expansive wonder to it. It sounds almost otherworldly in its quality. The next one. Major 6, kind of like the perfect fourth, it's open and ambiguous, and also very neutral, very reflective. Used a lot in love themes because it can give you that sense of reflective yearning, that major 6 sound. And just to point out, the major 6 is the inversion of the minor third, and you can see the minor third is very dark, somber, serious, jazzy. But here in this inversion, it gives you a very different quality: open, ambiguous, neutral, reflective. So you could use two tones that have the same relationship, invert them in adjacent to one another, and kind of turn the feeling and the sense of the narrative on its head. Go from a very dark kind of feeling to very open and a neutral sort of feeling between these two intervals. Next one. Augmented 6 is open, unresolved, also very jazzy. That's the minor 7th kind of quality. And it has a jazzy sort of feeling to it, very open. It wants to head somewhere else. So the augmented 6, minor 7, the augmented 5th, minor 6, and the tritone, these kind of have a very similar relationship. They kind of live in the same universe in terms of the feeling that they portray. The major 7th, which is the inversion of the minor 2nd, has a very similar kind of feeling. It has a kind of a pushing apart feeling, an aversion feeling. There's a tension there. It's open. It's very open, a lot of space between, but it is very unresolved. The major 7th works very well in relations to the minor 2nd because it has a lot of the same qualities to it. And the last one. Obviously, the octave, or the unison octave, is very solid, but it is singular. It doesn't have the strength of the fifth, of a perfect fifth. It's not a reinforcement. It's reinforced, but it's not a reinforcement of additional material. It has a very open space to it. You can create big open leaps by jumping an octave, very useful when writing angular melodies. So that is how I perceive these intervals. These are all the chromatic intervals, and I think it's important to take time to reflect upon this. So as you're writing a melody, you can choose note to note what the kind of ongoing narrative and time is supposed to imply by selectively choosing intervals that portray the kind of narrative that you're looking for. Now, this does not mean that going from one note to another absolutely gives you a feeling, and then going from that second note to another note gives you an immediate change in feeling. It doesn't really work that way. There is some element by which the entire context of the line does matter. However, if you do pick intervals that are quite complementary to each other, you can reinforce a very particular kind of sensation and emotional narrative. And that is very much worth considering in melodic writing. Is what do intervals imply when you move from one note to the next? Likewise, in terms of harmonic quality, the interval between two notes can be very beneficial to establish what that is. If you're not using full triads, or if you're using some kind of other unorthodox sort of harmonic structure that is not a chordal triad. So the next thing we're going to look at is basic intervallic chordal phenomenon. So this is the phenomenon, the experience, the emotional narrative that is perceived when one chord moves to another chord. Now, the way I did this is I have examples for the minor second. So that's two chords that are moving one to the next with a minor second difference between the root note. And I give you a major chord moving to a major chord and then back again so that you can get the reverse. Now, the reason why I want to give you the reverse sensation is because the reverse sensation gives you the idea of the inversion, what it feels like to hear it inverted. For example, the minor second is really the same thing as the major seventh in relationship, because obviously these chords could be inverted and they'd give you the same quality even if they were inverted and not necessarily in their root order. And you feel that when you go from the a changed chord back to the original. You get that kind of sensation of the second. So for this list, I only gave you the minor second, major second, minor third, perfect fourth, and augmented fourth. And by giving you those, we cover the inversions as well, the other possibilities. Now, these are major chords. And here I represented the exact same relationship in minor chords. And then I give you major to minor and back to major, and I give you minor to major and back to minor. And I do this for all of them. So we're going to listen to each one. Now, above what I wrote down here was I used kind of this, it depends on who you're talking to, which psychologist, the 6 or 7 basic emotions, feelings that we have in human experience. So we have happiness, surprise, sadness, anger, fear, anticipation. These are very primal, fundamental emotions. And what I did is for each one, I gave kind of an initial emotion, which in most cases, if not all cases, is happiness or sadness based on the first triad, whether it's major or minor. A secondary sort of emotion that comes about from the cooperation of these two chords, one going to the next. And then above that, I gave a sort of narrative quality. So I have heroic, a thriller, like a dramatic thriller or a suspense, drama, neutral, meaning that there's not really a very clear kind of sensation for it, a strong one anyway, and fantasy, and then also romantic. So these are kind of the major narrative themes that I've assigned to each one of these. And this is my own perception on this, and I invite you to do a very similar exercise with all these possibilities and create a list of maybe more specific narratives. That way you have a sort of library that you can call upon as you're doing your harmonic writing. So let's listen to each one of these in turn. So I call this happiness, surprise kind of feeling. It's a happy feeling. It's got an element of surprise to it, and I would think that this sounds somewhat heroic. It's a protagonist kind of sound to it. Next one. So we have the same idea, but in minor qualities. And you notice that on some of these, I changed the spelling so that it can easily be viewed as a triad. But these are actually the same root tones. You're going from D flat, C sharp. That's an enharmonic, enharmonically the same tone. So here I said sadness, anger, kind of a dramatic thriller sort of quality to it. Here's the next one. For this one, I perceive a brighter kind of context, but then this sense of fear, like something's changing, and there's a kind of fear element to it. And then the last one, minor to major to minor. It's got kind of a Latin jazz quality to it. I think it's got kind of an angrier sound. So it's got sadness, because of the minor chord quality. Going to that major, it's got a resolve to it that seems kind of angry to me, very dramatic. So I'd say this is would be useful for a drama type narrative. Next one, this is the major second. And this time what I'll do is, rather than stop to expound on these, I'm just going to play each one, and you can read here above what I've written for each one. See if you agree. Okay, so those are the major second, or the inversion thereof. If you're looking at the reverse, the return back to the first chord. Now, the implication here is that with a library like this, and this categorization of chord relationships, one could compose based on the turn of chords from one rooted position to another, or one chord to another, and you can establish a harmonic narrative based on the relationship, the perceived relationship between chords. This doesn't have to be based on the harmonic rhythm of a piece, meaning that there's chords changing, every measure or so on. This might be that you have a long line on a vamp of one chord or between two chords, and you really kind of drive home one idea. Maybe you're vamping back and forth between these two chords for a while, and then you modulate to another location, and you take your modulation through a relationship between the root position of this set of chords to a different location based on an interval. And by doing that, you can portray kind of an emotional quality in that direct modulation. Or you can have just one chord vamping without any kind of change, and then you can go from that chord vamp, might be an 8-measure vamp, to a related chord, and in that modulation, in that change, in that shift of pitch, you portray an emotion by doing that, just by moving everything to another place. That's kind of the idea. Let's listen to the minor third variations. Okay, and you can start to see this fantasy stuff kind of creeping in with the minor third relationship. It starts to sound otherworldly, often used for, deep sea kind of movie narratives, or outer space, or other kinds of fantasy, magical sorts of environments. And let's look at the major third. We're going to see some more of that same kind of quality here. And now the perfect fourth iterations. Now, it's worth it to bring up, especially as the chords are getting further and further apart, that all of these are in root position. But even if you were to invert the notes and you were to get them so that there's more comfortable voice leading, that's not really a topic of discussion for this video. But if you did have more comfortable voice leading, it would still portray the same quality. The voicing really doesn't change a lot of how these are perceived. You really can play them inverted so that they're moving more closely together. You get the same kind of sound, and you can experiment with that. And let's listen to the last one. This is the augmented fourth, diminished fifth set. So you can see how powerful this is. Rather than thinking about the function of harmony and what chords go together in terms of, period rules and whatnot, thinking more about that what they portray in a narrative sense, the emotional portrayal of the relationship between chords. That, I think, is a far more worthy consideration. It's something that has a greater benefit to spend your time thinking about than arbitrary rules that merely are based on period practice. Because again, the goal is communication. The goal is to touch a broad audience at an emotional level, at a narrative emotional level, at a phenomenological level, to make people feel something from the performance of the music. So this is, I think, a very, very strong way to look at chord relationships and look at tonal relationships. That is, I think, more application in writing music than concepts of theoretical analysis. There's a saying that we used to have in music school that composers are not theorists. Now, composers can know, and it's probably beneficial to know theoretical practices, particularly if you're writing period music. But the composer is not a theorist. The composer does not work in music theory. The composer works in language. The composer works in communication. The composer writes to touch people and to make statements, not necessarily to check all the boxes on a list of regulations. That doesn't really work well in terms of writing music, new music that serves to say something new and unique. Okay. However, I think thinking about relationships in this way absolutely does help you to do that very thing. So that's what we're after. Next, we're going to spend some time finally here looking at thickening up chords. So we've talked about the relationship between intervals and what that can mean. We've talked about the relationship between chords and different qualities, major and minor, basic triads, and how you can think about that and consider those relationships in terms of their emotional implications when you're writing and choosing chords to go from one chord to the next. Really not thinking about diatonic function at all. We're just thinking about, well, these chords portray this idea, and to go to a different idea, we move to a different set of a different relationship in chordal qualities. And by doing that, you're changing harmonically all the time to different keys and whatnot, different tonal centers, and really modulating quite freely when you think about music in that way without having to worry too much about how to modulate. But now let's look at how do we do this? How do we maintain a consonance and still have thick chords? So there's more than merely the triad going on. What kind of strategies can we take to maintain consonants, not make things too crunchy and awkward and chromatically grating? How do we do that? So one way that I like to do this is by using added note harmonies. I think there's two good choices and a third one that's useful in some circumstances. The first option has to do with the major chords, and that is to use an added second. Now, the reason why an added second works well with a major chord is because it adds in a major second between the major third. And what that means is that the second scale degree here, C to D, is a major second. It's not a minor second. It's a whole step apart, not a half step. So it doesn't have that grading kind of aversion or attraction that you find with a minor second. Instead, it's got a slightly more stable dissonance. It's more comfortable because of the space that's between. But also, the D to the E, the 2 to the 3, is also a major second. So we don't create a half step anywhere in this chord. There are no half step relationships, even though we have a closed down kind of spacing, 4 notes within the space of the triad. Another possibility is to add a 6, which does the same thing. We add a major second from the 5th to the 6th, but there's no minor second that's created by doing that. You could even put both of them together in the same chord. You could have a 5-note chord. It's more of a cluster now. And you see that you have no minor seconds in there. And then lastly, we can talk a little bit about extending the chord. This isn't really about an added note harmony. This is an extended tertian harmony, an added third. But a flat 7 also will keep you from having a minor second, because even if this was inverted, the flat 7 against the root is still a major second apart. So these are I think the good options for thickening up a major chord quality. So let's listen to these, see what they sound like. Now, while these may have some kind of jazzy quality to them, they're not particularly dissonant. They're not really dissonant. They still feel warm and consonant. Let's look at the minor side now. If we take a minor triad, I think you have a couple of good options here that will do the same thing. In this case, adding a second would be problematic, because a second against the minor third would create a minor second, and that would be awful dissonant. However, you can add a fourth. So rather than using a second for the major chord, we use the fourth for minor chords. So we add the fourth in, and now we have a major second between the flat 3 and the 4, and a major second between the 4 and the 5. Likewise, we can add a 6, but it needs to be a major 6, not the minor 6. If we add a flat 6, then the flat 6 against the 5 would give us a minor second. But a major 6, it keeps that minor second out that we're trying to avoid. We just have a major second up there, even in inversion. And then, of course, we can do both of them together. We get this kind of note cluster up here, but it's still a fairly consonant cluster because it's a major second apart between each note. Then over here we have a minor chord extended with a flat 7. So this is the same idea as an extended tertian harmony with a flat 7 in the major, but here we're just applying it to the minor. So you have a minor triad and then the flat 7 above that. And then, of course, we can add that same flat 7, and we can add the fourth to that as well. Likewise, you could add a flat 7 to the major and have the second. I didn't put it on the sheet up here, but that's a possibility too. So let's listen to these examples. Now, while all of these do sound tight, they sound like very tight harmonies, none of them sounds particularly dissonant, even the ones that sound minor. Now, I will point out that we have some comparison here. If you look at the major chord with the added 2 and 6 against the minor chord with the added 4 and flat 7, they're actually the same chord. They're just in an inversion. They have the same qualities, even though this is a major chord and this is a minor chord in root position. The perception of what they are is really determined by the voicing, which note is in the bass, what note is in the root. That tells you really what the quality is, if it's a major chord with added note harmonies, or if it's a minor chord with an extended harmony and an added note. And so on and so forth. So that's important, is that there is a lot of overlap. When you start adding notes in, you can start to call chords a lot of different things. And really the context of its position and its voicing will determine really what it is. And even then, there's some debate for a lot of different chords that have added notes to them. Here's an example using some of these chords up here, and this is completely diatonic. It's a diatonic chord progression, and we hit almost all of the root notes except for the 7th. Now over here for the last one, the 5 with a flat 7, it's just really just a 5/7. This could be a 7th chord, a diminished 7th chord with an added flat 6. That could be, it could also be that if the root was the 7th rather than the 5th. But you can listen to this progression and it'll repeat. You can see how smoothly this works. Also note that by doing this, these added notes in here create a situation where the D, the second scale degree, is in absolutely every single chord. This has a lot of good implications for music writing, particularly if you're going to write ostinato patterns. You have a common tone between every single chord that can be played, and you're covering almost the entire gamut diatonically that would be available to us. So let's listen to this example. This is a four note chord harmonies with these added notes. So it has a very pop music kind of feel to it, because pop music does operate in a lot of these conventions with added note harmonies or inverted extended harmonies. It has somewhat of a jazzy quality to it, even though these aren't overtly jazz chords. Just a very simple idea of adding harmonies in there, adding notes to the harmony that avoid minor second tension. It gives a warmth to it and a density while still maintaining the consonance of the key that we're trying to abide by and the function of these chords within a diatonic key. So just some things to think about. And obviously this is not exhaustive. You can use these added harmonies in a very similar way applied to the chords that we just looked at, the relationship between chords in terms of their intervallic relationship. You can add a density to these chords by adding these seconds or fourths or sixths or extending with sevenths and whatnot. Something to experiment with. But that's a way to achieve density and still preserving the consonance of the sound that is, I think, acceptable to most people. Rather than turning them off with awkward and weird dissonance. Next, I want to look briefly at basic a chordal expansion and compression. So there's other harmonies. You don't have to use triads. We can augment a triad. So we have a major third between all three notes. And we can also expand out and create wider intervals between the notes of the chord, such as intervals of a fourth or a fifth. And we can extend those even further as well. So here I'm going to show you an augmented triad, which gives us a very strong sense of wonder. And then I'll give you an example of chordal harmony where the intervals are a perfect fourth between each. And then an extended version of that where we have another perfect fourth for three complete intervals of a perfect fourth, and then quintal harmony, which is the space of a fifth. It has a very similar feeling to the chordal harmony. It's an inversion of that, and then an extended quintal harmony. And this, I think, establishes what we know as Copland-esque Americana. So the music of Aaron Copland that really defined the American sound, particularly the Western American sound and the frontier, country frontier kind of sound that we've come accustomed to in American music. So you can write music and really stick to these conventions, and you can even move inside and out of more traditional triadic harmony and into these open spacings. You want to be very careful about the transitions, that they are logical and formulated, but you can do it. You can kind of mix and match. Generally, though speaking, if you're going to stick to an open spacing and kind of create this sense of Americana, you want to be fairly consistent with it in the way that you do it. Or at least be episodic about the way that you use it, that for a period of significant time, you're kind of sitting inside of this convention before you escape from it and go back to more traditional harmonies and vice versa. And lastly, we'll talk about the compression side of it. This is going the other direction. Rather than opening up the spacing, we're condensing it down. And of course, we're dealing with diminished quality. So I just have a diminished triad where you have a minor third between each, and then a half diminished seventh, and then a fully diminished seventh, which is cyclical. So in this case, you can invert this chord any way that you want, and it's essentially still the same chord, just perceived with a different root. All these intervals are exactly precisely a minor third apart all the way through. It doesn't matter how you invert it. We have a double flat, a B double flat, which would really just be an A. So let's listen to these. And there you have it. So these are some very basic concepts that you can use to write fairly sophisticated music without having to dig deep into the weeds of harmonic theory and various theoretical constructs that can get very complex and convoluted. And just by evaluating these ideas, you really deal pretty well, as I said before, with even just the concept of modulation, which can be very troublesome for people. You can freely modulate, directly modulate quite easily and quite fluidly. And one thing I want you to keep in mind is that as you thicken up harmonies and add notes, what it does is it gives you more commonality, as you saw in this example, with the more notes that are involved in chords, the more commonality of tones that you have, and the easier it is to move between tonal centers because of the shared commonality of notes. So just something to think about and some ideas to motivate your music at a more emotional level rather than at a theoretical, rule-based or regulation-based functional level, which I don't think is terribly helpful. I think thinking about emotion and thinking about narrative is a much better endeavor when writing music. Leave the analysis to the theorists. Leave the emotion to the composers. So best of luck with this, and happy composing.